In this video, I want to talk about coercion, particularly the Bidermans Chart of coercion. It was a table developed by Biderman in 1957, and he did it to illustrate the methods that the Chinese and Korean torture had on American prisoners during the Korean War. It lists 8 general methods of torture that psychologically break an individual. Anyone going through an emotionally abusive relationship or that has been in one might recognise some of these. Hello and welcome to the Divorce Sanctuary. My name is Elizabeth Goddard. I am the author of Finding Lily and the A to Z of Emotional Abuse. On this channel I talk about healing from emotional abuse and divorcing emotionally from the emotional abuser. If you're new to the channel, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you're returning, welcome back and thank you. I was watching something the other day and they were quoting from the Bidermans Chart of coercion. They were talking about coercion but in a different form, and I just recognised it from the emotional abuse perspective. So I thought I'd share with you the Bidermans Chart of coercion. So Albert Biderman was a social scientist and he was with the US Air Force, assigned to research why many American prisoners of war captured by communist forces during the Korean War were cooperating. So after extensive interviews with returned prisoners of war, Biderman concluded that there were 3 major elements behind the communist interrogators' coercive control, and they were dependency, debility and dread. Biderman summarised his findings in a chart which was first published in the paper Communist Attempts to Elicit False Confessions from the Air Force Prisoners of War in 1957, the issue of the Bulletin of New York Academy of Medicine. The paper was an analysis of the psychological rather than physical methods used to coerce information and false confessions. And psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton conducted similar research into the same Chinese methods, coining the term thought reform, now known as brainwashing. Coercion methods. So the chart includes the following coercion methods: isolation, monopolization of perception, induced deliberation and exhaustion, threats, occasional indulgences, demonstrating omnipotence and omniscience, degradation, enforcing trivial demands. In 1973, a report on torture by Amnesty International stated that Biderman's Chart of coercion contained the universal tools of torture and coercion. In 2002, US military trainers offered an entire training class to Guantanamo Bay detention camp interrogators. In 2008, documents revealed to the congressional investigators that these methods were being used at the camp. And according to Wikipedia, the New York Times was the first to recognise that the methods were verbatim to those contained in Biderman's chart. Biderman's chart of coercion is also applied to domestic violence, with many noting that psychological methods used by abusive partners are nearly identical to that on the chart. And it's something I hear so often. Is there a book? Do they take a course on this stuff? And I will put in the description box below the links to the resources. So in the Biderman's Chart of coercion, the first method that's described is isolation, depriving the victim of all their social support network. If you've been in an emotionally abusive relationship, you might have found yourself isolated from your friends and family. The emotional abuser believed that you were their possession. They resented the time that you spent with others and the importance you put on those relationships, including the ones with your children. You're isolated from your support network because they couldn't risk you confiding in anyone else. So they make up these stories to discredit them. And they did this to protect themselves. So if your friends or family had approached you with any concerns, you would actually question their motives and their reliability rather than the emotional abusers. You might have even isolated yourself following the idealization stage, believing that you'd found this amazing creature who'd walked into your life, who you wanted to spend as much time with as possible. Or you may have isolated yourself because you knew part of you knew if you did tell anyone what was happening in the relationship, they would have confirmed your fears that it wasn't healthy. And during the cycle of abuse, they were ensuring that you were more invested in the relationship, that you were in protecting yourself. And they also told you repeatedly how lucky you were to have them in your life. When Biderman was writing his chart of coercion, he was looking at the psychological effects from the prisoners of war and how they cooperated, how they were tricked and duped. Their isolation might have been solitary, it might have been partial, it might have been part of a group. And the second element is monopolization of perception, which is fixing attention upon immediate predicament, eliminates the information not in compliance with their demands, punishes independence and or resistance. Abusers are masters of manipulation, and they use words to deceive, to coerce, to seduce, mislead, to gain power and control. They tell you that they love you or that you're soulmates. They tell you that they're the victim in every one of their relationships. They manufacture emotions, and these emotions aren't entirely unfamiliar to you. You might have felt them before, but they were manufactured for a purpose. So they create situations that heighten your feelings of jealousy, of neediness, of rage, anxiety, doubt and insecurity. They are carefully manufactured. You may never have considered yourself as a particularly jealous person, but in this relationship, you experienced emotions very unfamiliar to you. And when you said anything, they blame shifted and you were told that it was all your fault. So these emotions were manufactured from triangulation, from ghosting, devaluation, the trauma bonding that took place. Your abuser was a very insecure person, and they needed to make sure that you were hooked, to ensure that you were not going to abandon them. And this was a game. They love to play with people's emotions. They love to see how much control they can gain over someone. And this started really early in the relationships, little baby steps to see if you would move your boundaries. Because if you did, they knew that they could push them and push them and push them. In the Bidermans Chart of Coercion, other variants include physical isolation, darkness or bright light, restricted movement, monotonous food. The third method was humiliation and degradation. And the effect and purpose of this was to make resistance more costly than compliance. When you start to discover information about abusive relationships, and particularly emotionally abusive relationships, you discover something called the cycle of abuse, which runs from idealization to devaluation to discard. And the discards aren't final until obviously the final discard. So the discards could be withdrawing of attention, disappearing for periods of time. But the humiliation side comes under the belittling, the put downs that are masters fake friendliness, or they might be advice, or they may have offered you some words of wisdom. During the idealization stage, you were swept off your feet with the love bombing. During the devaluation stage, the abuser checked to make sure that you're more invested in protecting the relationship than you were in protecting yourself. And they did this by making comments about your intelligence or your abilities, or perhaps your goals and dreams. So if you questioned them, they might have told you that you were being oversensitive, or they were only joking, they were just kidding. And these belittling comments and subtle put-downs were followed by idealization, which changes the chemicals in your body And you found yourself being addicted, so you overrode your intuition. During the devaluation stage, they withdrew the attention you received at the start of the relationship, and then you begin to accept any little crumb that they throw your way. They use techniques such as triangulation, and they may have talked way too much about their crazy exes or about anyone that gives them attention, creating jealousy. And they use this tactic to draw you to them, creating situations that make them look popular, so you would fight for their attention, fearing perhaps that you might lose the abuser and the attention that you're receiving. And not to mention the hormones such as dopamine and oxytocin that are being released into your body. They create these triangles as they love to turn people against each other, and they perhaps kept you just far enough apart so you can't compare anything, but close enough to ensure that you know each other is a threat. They manufacture situations to make you feel jealous, to question their fidelity. And you might have experienced gaslighting, where they convinced you what you were feeling wasn't real, or that you didn't understand the situation, or your facts were wrong. And these are so believable that you actually start to question yourself. You may have discovered their lies and they told you that you were wrong, or that you'd misunderstood the situation, and they possibly told you you're too sensitive. Perhaps they accused you of having trust issues, and you might have questioned if you were wrong. Did you misunderstand what you'd been told? Perhaps you had forgotten what they had told you, or you weren't listening. This spiral of questioning can then go on for a long time, even after the relationship is over, years after the relationship is over, and it takes a long time to untangle. And following the devaluation stage, the abuser tests you by discarding you in some way. So they did this to make sure that you were bonded to them. So they might have disappeared, or you were unable to get hold of them when you should have been. And they then reappeared with a gift or a compliment and giving you back that feeling you had at the beginning of the relationship, and reaffirming that they do love you. You did notice the cracks in their mask. You justified it though, because their actions kept reaffirming their love and they kept taking you back to the love bombing stage again and again and again. And your resistance would be the loss of the relationship, so you complied. And in the Biderman Chart of Coercion, the variants that are quoted are personal hygiene prevented, demeaning punishments, insults and taunts, and denial of privacy. And the fourth method is exhaustion, weakens mental and physical ability to resist. Long-term contact with a toxic or emotionally abusive person causes damage to the brain. Abuse causes damage to the hippocampus, which is a structure in the brain that is in the shape of this little seahorse. They're found on either side around where your ears are situated. And this is the area of the brain that's used for learning and for memory. And damage to the hippocampus can result in memory loss. The stress caused by an emotionally abusive relationship triggers the hormones cortisol, adrenaline and noradrenaline, which causes the hippocampus to shrink. And this can happen when a child or an adult is under constant threat from intimidating or bullying behaviour. It could be through fear of abandonment or destruction of a favourite object or toy. Damage to the hippocampus can happen when a child or an adult experiences criticism, belittling, name-calling, yelling, swearing, verbal humiliation. It can also occur when children and adults are isolated from friends and family, not allowing them to have friends or preventing them from attending groups or classes outside the home. Research from Yale and Stanford University using veterans and victims of childhood abuse suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder used MRI scans to show the reduction of the hippocampus. And these studies showed that traumatic or highly stressful experiences can have long-term effects on the structure and the function of the brain. When we experience stress, our bodies receive the hormone cortisol, causing the fight or flight response. And according to New York University, high levels of cortisol may damage the cells in the hippocampus. In Biderman's chart of coercion, there are other variants that were noted, which were semi-starvation, sleep deprivation, prolonged interrogation, overexertion. And the fifth method is threats. Creates anxiety and despair, outlines cost of non-compliance. In emotionally abusive relationships, they create the feeling of danger and fear. Fear in these relationships is feeling of loss or deep emptiness. So your brain isn't working and you can't compute anything. So you've been programmed over months and years to believe that you needed the abuser to survive and that anyone else was a threat to you and your safety. And then one day they walk away. You have no idea what's going on or how you're going to survive without them. You may have even realised that you had a life before you met them, and you wonder how and why you experienced so much fear, and you don't know how to live. The stress hormones are raging around your body, and to protect yourself from the trauma, your brain went into hibernation. Their insecurities and their fears were projected onto you. There was a type of bartering that went on which you were unaware of. Instead of it being an even swap where you both benefited, you had something that they wanted and they took it. They had an insecurity or something that they didn't like about themselves and they gave it to you. Their biggest fear is abandonment, and they do everything to strip you of your self-esteem and make you fearful of them abandoning you. The emotion is indescribable, but it is due to the gaslighting and the cognitive dissonance which transpires into fear. In the Biderman chart of coercion, the variants are threats to kill, threats of abandonment or non-return, threats against the family, vague threats, mysterious changes of treatment. And the sixth method is occasional indulgences. So it's positive motivation for compliance, hinders adjustment of deprivation. In emotionally abusive relationships, there's a cycle of abuse. And the first part is idealization. It's also known as love bombing. At the very beginning of the relationship, everything you do and everything you said was watched and noted. You were a project. They swept you off your feet with maybe compliments, gifts, days out, maybe meals out. Your needs were catered for. And this was deliberate. The text messages that were sent early in the morning ensured that they were the first thing you thought about. And again, the same at the end of the day. So you went to bed thinking about them. It allowed them to manufacture a relationship where you had so much in common. You shared so many hopes and dreams. You had the same insecurities. They told you that no one had ever understood them in the way that you did, and that you were soulmates. They might have said things like, we have so much in common, we have the same hopes and dreams, we share the same insecurities. You are beautiful, I've never felt this way, we are soulmates. They listened and mirrored what was important to you, and then repeated back as if they were their own. And as part of this process, they begin not only to take over your life, but also your future. They created a bond that they later became so hard for you to let go of. They created a fake future with you. Nothing about it was real, but the stories around it were so believable, and you were there planning it with them. You shared the same insecurities, and of course they told you many times about their awful childhood. You listened to them and helped them, and they praised you. But you may have wondered who was going to help you or when it was your turn. You were boosted higher and higher onto a pedestal, and you were told that no one had ever understood them. They never met anyone like you. You were amazing. And then they might have compared you to their exes. And what was actually happening? They were training you to supply them with compliments. And they were also instilling at the same time that you needed to look nice for them, to impress them. They told you that they'd never met anybody like you. You were very special. And when they compared you to their exes, they were affirming to you that they were exes for a reason. They were covertly telling you that if you wanted to stay in this relationship, that you'd better not do what the ex had done, or you would be one of those in the long line of crazy exes. You never did get round to commenting or questioning what the common denominator was in these relationships. And then they went into the devaluation and discard stages. And when you started to question what was going on, you were told that it was either your fault, you were too sensitive, or that they were only joking. And they whisked you back round to the idealization stage. But each time you might have found it harder to get back there. In Biderman's chart of coercion, the variants for the occasional indulgences are occasional favours, rewards for partial compliance, and promises. The sixth method is demonstrating omnipotence, suggests futility of resistance. Omnipotence is the quality of having unlimited or very great power. And that's exactly what an emotionally abusive relationship is about. It's about power and control. And I use the term a lot throughout all of my videos, throughout my book, and in any writing that I do. This is the manipulation of one person over another. The emotional abuser or toxic person is the master of manipulation. They use words and actions to deceive, to coerce, to seduce, mislead, and to gain power and control over everyone in their life. They are very insecure people, and their biggest fear is being abandoned themselves. So they do everything in their power not to be, and they need to be in control of everyone and everything in their life. And in Biderman's chart of coercion, the variants would include confrontation and showing complete control over a victim. And the last one, number 8, is forcing trivial demands. Develops habits of compliance. You might find yourself enmeshed in the relationship, a dysfunctional state where 2 or more people have poor boundaries. Enmeshment can occur between a parent and a child, whole families, adult couples. Very slowly during the idealization stage, they told you how amazing you were. They put on a mask and played the character that they very carefully extracted from you, understanding who you were looking for. And they broke down your boundaries, pushing against them to see how far that they could go and what they could get away with. You maybe saw the red flags and you might have challenged their behaviour, but they were so persuasive. You believed their answers, and very slowly they eroded your boundaries and you became dependent on them. You were enmeshed and your identity was gone. This is one of the reasons that people coming out of these relationships feel so awful. They don't know who they are. They've lost their self-worth and they've lost themselves. You find yourself tiptoeing around a person or a situation, walking on eggshells, trying to be very careful not to upset them or cause a narcissistic rage. So you avoid saying things and doing things just to keep the peace, not wanting to wake up that monster. And you might experience things like word salad, and this is a form of communication which doesn't make sense. It fails to progress the discussion in any way, or where there is no outcome. This is done in various ways. It could be the combination of circular conversations, projection, or blame shifting, but it's all done in an attempt to confuse you and gain control over the conversation and you. These conversations don't make sense, and when you try to understand what is actually being said, they move the conversation in a different direction. They might have brought up your wrongdoings as an attempt to cover up their behaviour, and then they play the victim. If you try to be part of the conversation, which really is one-sided and more rhetorical, you were told to stop interrupting them. And when they did allow you to speak, they talked over the top of you, confusing you further. And you possibly ended up giving up and wondering what happened, leaving them feeling powerful. And in the Bidermans Chart of Coercion, the last one is enforcement of rules. I'll put the link to the Bidermans Chart of Coercion, which is from Amnesty International 1994. And it states at the top, it's a tool designed to demonstrate and explain the coercive methods of stress manipulation used to torture prisoners of war. It has been applied to explain the coercive techniques used by perpetrators of domestic abuse. This list directly reflects to the original chart. It has not been changed to fit the domestic abuse context. But you can see how interlinked it is. This was used to coerce prisoners of war to hand over information, hand over their power. I'm sure if you have been through an emotionally abusive relationship, one or more of these techniques will have been used on you. I hope you found this useful. If you'd like to find out more ways of working with me, I'll put the links to my website in the description box below, along with the links to both my books, Finding Lily and the A to Z of Emotional Abuse. I'll also put the links to my 2 free workbooks, Turn Broken into Your Superpower and Self-Care is Vital, in the links below as well. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and I'm sending you loads and loads and loads of love.